Hello everyone and welcome to JavaScript Mastery. In this video, I'll teach you everything you need to know about creating a simple API using Node and Express. There's a high chance you came across the term REST API if you thought about getting data from a source on the internet, such as Facebook or GitHub. But what is a REST API? And more importantly, how can you build one? There are some more often used terms and technologies when building APIs, such as Express, Node, Postman, and Crud API. I don't like talking too much about ideas, architectures, and methodologies. I'm here to show you how all of that works in practice so that you can build your own APIs. Let's dive right in. Let's say you're trying to find videos on YouTube. You open up YouTube, type something into a search bar, and hit enter. And then you see a list of videos about that search term. A REST API works in a similar way. You search for something and you get a list of results back from the service you're requesting from. An API is an application programming interface. It is a set of rules that allow programs to talk to each other. The developer creates the API on the server and allows the client to talk to it. REST determines how the API looks like. It stands for Representational State Transfer. It is a set of rules that developers follow when they create their APIs. Nowadays, almost all APIs are REST APIs, so don't worry about that too much. And finally, what is CRUD? CRUD is an acronym for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. It is another set of rules we're going to follow while building our API. Almost every website is a CRUD in a sense. For example, whenever we have a database of users, we need to be able to create user accounts, get or read the profile details, update the profile details, and finally delete an account. This was just a short theory introduction, but as I said at the beginning, I'm here to show you how all of that works in practice so that you can build your own APIs. Now let's start coding. First, we need to download Node.js. Node.js is a JavaScript runtime, and all that it does is it allows JavaScript to be run in places other than the Chrome or other browsers. We can run it in the console or in our terminal. We're going to use that to create server-side JavaScript applications. If you worked with frontend so far, this is going to be something that's completely new to you. But don't worry, this video is for everyone who is just starting with Node and Express and has never built their own API before. So now, how do we download it? Well, we just click this button. I would recommend downloading the new current version because there we can use imports and exports. So just do that. Even if you do have it installed already, just install it one more time and then you can check for your version once we go to Visual Studio Code. Secondly, we'll be using Express. Express is, as you can see, fast, unopinionated, minimalist web framework for Node. Just keep in mind these last words. So it is a framework for Node.js. Express is going to help us create different routes for our API. And finally, we'll be using Postman. Postman is going to help us make different requests to our APIs so that we can test all of our endpoints. With that out of the way, let's move to Visual Studio Code. Right now, I'm inside of Visual Studio Code in an empty folder. It's called Node Express API. You can create your own empty folder and just drag and drop it into Visual Studio Code and we should be good to go. I prefer Visual Studio Code because it has a nice built-in terminal we're gonna use. So if you go under View at the top and then Terminal, the terminal is going to show up and then we can run some commands right there. So what do we need to do to initialize our backend JavaScript application? You can run npm init and then put a flag of y just like this and then click enter. This is going to create an empty package.json with barely something in it. We have the name, we have the version, description, and the main file, which we are going to create right away. In here, you can see that we do have some scripts. Later, we're going to add our own starting script. With that out of the way, we can create an index.js file, which is going to be the starting point of our server. Inside of here, we'll be using Express, so let's install it right away. npm install --save and just Express like so. It's gonna install and then we'll be able to do import Express from Express. Before, we had to do something like this. Const express is equal to require, and then in here we put the express. These two are equivalent. Right now, you should be running the latest Node version, so you can type node and then -v in the terminal, and you should be getting 14.5. If you have that installed, then we can go back to the package.json and just add one simple thing that's gonna allow us to use the imports. That something is gonna be type, make sure to use double quotes, equal to module. As soon as you add this, we'll be able to use normal, or let's say newer, import statements like this. Great. The second thing we're gonna need is going to be import body parser from body-parser, just like this. This allows us to take in incoming post request bodies. Again, that sentence maybe doesn't make a lot of sense right now, but you're gonna see it in action really soon. Then we need to initialize our express application by doing const app is equal to express, and we call that express as a function. Now our whole application lies in this little variable. Below that, we can specify the port of our application. We can use capital letters because we are never gonna change this port. And since frontends are often on localhost 3000, let's use 5000 for backend. Of course, this can be any number. Then we can initialize the body parser middleware by doing something like app.use, and then in there we do body parser.json. We call it as a function. This is just gonna say that we're gonna be using JSON data in our whole application. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it is a common format for sending and requesting data through a REST API. Don't worry about the syntax, because a JSON object looks like a JavaScript object, so you're going to be completely at home with this. There are some small differences though. In JSON, each property and value must be wrapped with double quotation marks instead of single quotation marks, but that's just it. And finally, we can make our application listen for incoming requests by saying app.listen. In here, we specify the port we want to listen on, and then we create a callback function which is going to be executed once we run the server. Okay, in this case, we're just going to have a simple console log, console.log, and we're gonna say server running on port, and then that's gonna be HTTP, make sure to do HTTP and not HTTPS, // localhost, and then in there we can use the template strings to put the port in inside like this, but make sure to change this from regular strings to template strings using the backticks, just like this. Okay, now our server is ready and we can actually run it. So right now, if I do node and then run our index.js like so, it's gonna say server running on port localhost 5000, and I just noticed we are missing a small detail right there. It should be localhost with a colon just after it. So now if we save, notice how nothing is happening in the console. That's because once we run it, we need to rerun it one more time every time to get the changes, as you can see right there. Now we can click it. That's the problem. We don't want to save the file and then every time close the server and then run it again for changes to occur. That's why we have a package called Nodemon. We can install Nodemon by typing npm install --save-dev, and then we can say Nodemon. Why did we use the dev? Well, because when we push or publish our application, no one is gonna be running our server. So we are installing this dependency only for our own development purposes. It's not gonna be used later. That's why we have it as a dev dependency. Now, if you go back to our package.json, you should be able to see dependencies express and dev dependency Nodemon. Great. So how do we run our application with Nodemon? Well, let's set up a script. In here, we're gonna remove this test script, create our own start script. So we can say start, and then just after it, we need to use double quotation marks, and in here, we'll just do Nodemon index.js. This is going to make sure that we start our application using Nodemon, and as I said, Nodemon is going to keep making changes whenever we save a file. So if we now save this, go back to our index.js, let's try running our npm start command. Okay, great. Server running on port localhost 5000, and if I was, for example, to change this R to capital R and then save the file, you can see Nodemon restarting due to changes and then starting the server again, and we do get our change right here. That's amazing. We just set up a basic Express server. So what can we do with it? Now that our application is running, we can visit our API by going to http localhost 5000. You can control or command click this or copy it and paste it into a URL bar. If we go there right now, we do get some kind of an error. Cannot get /. Why is that happening? Well, if we go back, Node and Express primarily are all about routing. So we need to create some routes which we can then visit with our browser, or we can send requests to. So in this case, we're going to create our first route. That's going to be app.get. As you can see, we can create different routes of different types right there if we do dot and then something. In this case, we are expecting a GET request, and then the first parameter is the path we're expecting that request to. In this case, this is going to be a GET request to the / or the home page. Then the second parameter is the callback function. We can do it like so, callback function. It accepts two parameters, request and response. In here, let's do a simple const log just so we can see if it is running. So let's just do test, just like so. It's really noticeable, all uppercase. And then also let's do res.send. So we'll do res.send and we will say hello from homepage, just like that. Whenever we have just a root page, this one here, that usually means that it is a home page. So if we now save this and we go back to our home page, feel free to refresh, and we do get hello from homepage. That's not the only thing that happened. The console log is not gonna be in the Chrome's console, rather it's gonna be right here. As you can see, we do get console log of test with an exclamation mark, which means that the code from this callback function was ran once we visited the /. When I say visited, I mean we made a GET request to the /. Remember, browsers can only make GET requests. For example, if you visit google.com, you are making a GET request to the google.com domain. The same thing happened here. We visited localhost 5000 and that made the GET request to the / or just to the home root route. Of course, our API is going to have many more routes. So right now we can delete this. We can just have the res.send. And since this is only one thing, we can immediately leave it in a short arrow function syntax. Amazing. So what is our API going to do? Well, we will be handling some users. Handling users in a database is a great example because that is something you're going to be using in each and every application. This is how it's gonna look like. We're going to make 5 different routes. The first one is going to be the get route to the /users. This is gonna find all the users in our mock database. The second thing is a post request to /users. It is going to create a user. Then, if we want to find user details for a specific user by ID, we're going to make a GET request to /users and then / the dynamic parameter of ID. We can also delete a user by ID or update user details by ID. So now let's start with creating the routes. So now let's start creating routes for users. We mentioned that this index.js file is only going to be for the setup of the server. We don't want to add 10 or 20 different complex routes here. So how are we going to do the routing? Well, we're going to create a folder called routes. And then inside of there, we can create the name of the file, and that's going to be something which all of our routes are starting with. In our case, that's going to be users.js. Inside of here, we'll also use Express from Express. So import Express from Express. And then we need to use something called a router coming from express.router. Watch out, there is a capital R here on express.router. With this, we initialized our router. In the similar fashion to this thing here, app.getSomething, in here we'll use the router.getSomething or router.delete or router.post. You'll see in a moment why are we doing it this way. The path of the first route is going to be to /users. Once we visit that, we do have a callback function. Each callback function in Express has the request and the response objects. In here, for now, let's just say res.send and let's put hello from here, just so we can know if we've gotten to the correct route in the browser. Okay, so now this is just a new file in the new folder. We are never actually using it. So we need to export default the router so that we can make use of it in the index.js file. So export default router. Once we go to the index.js file, we can now import that. So let's do that like import users routes from /routes/users.js. Make sure to include this JS extension, and we named it user routes because as you can see, the file is called users. When using default imports, we can name this anything we'd like, but users routes is really descriptive. And then how do we make use of that? Well, just below this body parser, we'll say app.use. And in here, we set the starting path for all the routes in the users file. What do you think that's gonna be? If we go back to this picture, you can see something that all routes have. They are all starting with users. So in here, we're going to specify the path of /users. And what's gonna happen when people visit /users? In here, we're going to run these routes. So users routes. The routes we just imported from the users file in the routes folder. So how does this work? If we now go back to the /users and let's try to actually reach this. We said we want to get the GET request to /users. Right here, /users. If you now go to the browser, you should be able to see that, of course, we have the home page, we had that before, but now in the URL bar, if you type /users, you see cannot get /users, which means that our request is not correct. We are not getting the hello. Why is that so? That's because in the index.js file, we specified that all user routes are already gonna be starting with users. So in here, we're getting kind of redundant. This is actually pointing to /users/users, which doesn't make any sense. So in here, we just need to have the /. All routes in here are starting with /users. And then whatever we add onto them, in this case, we don't want to add anything, as you can see in the image here. Great. So now if we do that, if we save it and go back to the browser, we should be able to refresh and see hello. As you can see, there it is. That means that our route is correctly set up, and now we can actually move to the logic of creating different users. Let's create a mock representation of our user schema. So in here, we can create a new file and we can say user.json, just for example. In here, we can create a representation of how our user document should look like. It's gonna be a pair of curly braces, and then inside, remember, this is JSON, so we need to use double quotes. We're going to have a user that's going to have a name. Let's do John for the first one. And then let's say last name. Of course, we can then do this to be the first name, last name, John Doe. You're gonna see John Doe popping often in tutorials. That's just a generic name. And then let's also do age. For example, let's do 25. As you can see, it's really similar to normal JavaScript objects, but there's only one thing that you need to have double quotes. You also cannot have so-called trailing commas. You need to do it like this. Okay, so now we know how our person object is going to look like. Let's try to create our mock database containing two different users. Inside of the user's routes, I'm going to create just a normal array, so just array, and we're gonna call it users. Const users is gonna be equal to an array. And then inside of there, I'm gonna copy our John person and just paste them inside of here. Now our users array has one object with the first name of John, last name of Doe, and the age of 25. Great. Since this is not JSON, we can also remove the string signs on the keys of objects. Great. So now if we do that and save the file, let's try to console log our John right here. So console log users, and let's console log all the users, although we currently have one. Okay, when we go to /users, we get some JSON data. As you can see, we can collapse it or uncollapse it. Maybe this looks just like a plain text for you, just a plain empty black string. If that's the case, go to your Chrome store with the extensions or any other browser store and download something called Json Formatter. As you can see here with Json Formatter, I can see the text raw or parsed. So if I click raw, this is how our JSON file looks like. But of course, it's much nicer having it parsed. So feel free to download that. And that's it. As you can see, we already have our get route for all the users. Let's add one more just so we can have two. For example, let's do first name. That's gonna be Jane. And then we can do the last name, also Doe, and the age is gonna be, for example, 24, just like that. If we save it, go back to our browser, and also as you can see here, we also got our users in the console log once we visited that route. If we go back, save it, we now do get 2 users. That's great. And in here, we have our users. Now we need to add the functionality of adding users to our database. We're going to go below this router.get and we're going to create a new route. This time it's going to be router.post. It can no longer be a get route or get request because we need to send some data from the front end to the server. That data being the values in the forms user inputted. For example, whenever you see a sign up or login form, there you have username, first name, age. These are data values that we need to send from the client to the server for the user to be created. So that's why we are using a router.post method. In here, the path is going to be, again, just /users. We're just saying /. And then we have the request and response callback function. In here now, we'll have to deal with some actual data we'll be sending in. For testing the post route, we can no longer use Chrome or any browser for that matter. Why is that so? Because whenever you type something into the URL bar, it's making only a GET request. So browsers can only make GET requests. That's why we need a software which can help us test our API. And that's where Postman comes in handy. You can just go to the postman.com and then to the download page. In here, you can just click download, install it to your device, and then open it. Once you do, you should be having something like this. So how can we make different requests with that? Well, we go to this plus icon on the top, and in here, you can see that we have something similar to the browser's URL bar. In here, we can say localhost and then 5000. And right now, let's try making a GET request to localhost 5000 to see if we get anything. And we get hello from homepage. Let's now do localhost 5000 /users. We know that that's gonna give us some JSON data, as you can see here, in a nicely formatted way, even with some line numbers. And now what we can do here, but what we cannot do in Chrome, is we can change the type of the request. So in here, we can make a post request to the same or different route. So how do we send some data in? Well, you need to move here from params to the body tab. Then you need to go to the raw and then change the text to JSON. So we'll be sending data in the JSON format. So what data do we want to send to the database? Well, we want to create a user, of course. So we're going to create something similar we created in the mock user JSON file. In here, of course, the user needs to have a first name. Keep in mind that this needs to be wrapped in double quotes. The name is gonna be, let's say Johnny this time. Then we have the last name. That can be a son, so let's do Doe one more time. And then let's do the age of 10. That's it. So if we do this, we are sending some data to our post route. How can we see that? If we go back to our Visual Studio Code, in here, let's do a simple console.log and we'll say route reached, or let's add post route reached so that we can know if this callback function was fired. Along with the console log, let's also add the res.send. That's something that's going to be sent back to the client side. And we can say the same thing, post route reached, just for now. So if you save the file and then go back to Postman, you should be able to click the send button. And as you can see, the response is going to pop up right there. It says post route reached. And also in here in the terminal, you can see post route reached. Great. So how can we actually add the user to our database? Well, in this case, we are using a mock database, which is just a single array with some objects. It's not going to be stored once we add the user. Every time we call a new server or we refresh a server, it's going to be changed and go back to just 2 users. So if you want me to create a new video where we are going to interact with real database, MongoDB in this case, just let me know, and that's going to be the topic of the next video. But for now, let's keep working with the mock database. Of course, the point of this video is to learn Express and Node. So just think about it. How would you add a value to the array? Just a push method, right? So let's do exactly that. In here, we're gonna call the users and then do the push method. What do we wanna push? That's the great question. We wanna push what we send from here. This is the user. So how do we get to that data? When we are working with post requests, we have something known as a request.body. So let's console log the full request.body so we can see what's hidden inside of it. If we save the file one more time and restart this request, now you can see we do get the full object right here. It's being stored in the request.body. Now we can put that into a constant. So let's do const user is equal to rec.body. And now that we have the user, the easy thing to do is to just push that user to our current users array. The other thing that we can do is we can provide a useful message to the client side once they make the request. So let's remove these console logs and this one as well. And let's just send something useful. We'll send a template string, which is going to say user with the username. And then in here, we can use template strings, user that first name. Sorry, it's not going to be username. It's going to be user with the name something added to the database. That's it. So now if we save this, if we go back one more time and let's try adding Johnny again, save it, user with the name Johnny added to the database. That way we can be sure we added Johnny. Great. So now, why is this special? What did we do? We just pushed the user, but can we somehow see the action of our doing? Well, if we go back to our browser right here and now refresh the page, or rather make a GET request to the localhost 5000/users, you should be able to see that now we do have 3 users. We can also check that out if we make the GET request to the same route using Postman right here. Send, and as you can see, we do get 3 values. That's amazing. You just created the GET route to get all the users, and we also create the POST route so that we can add users to our database. Amazing. The thing that we need to do next is we need to be able to get the details of only one single user. For example, if we are logged in as John, we need to get back the details about John's profile. So for that, we need some kind of an ID, some kind of difference from which we can differentiate all the users. Right now, of course, the name John only shows up, so we could search by that. But of course, there are going to be many other people named John in our big application. So for that, it's good to use some kind of unique ID. There is a package on npm called UUID, and as you can see, it has 31 million weekly downloads, which means that it is a really popular package. So what does it do? We can install it, of course, by just typing npm install UUID. Let's do that right away. To close this terminal, you need to press Ctrl+C to close it, and then we can run this command. In here, you can see that we just imported, and we just call it as a function. Once we do call it, it gives us this huge string with unique numbers. This string is never going to be the same as any other string created. It uses different timestamps, namespaces, random cryptography, and a lot of different things to make sure that this is never going to occur again. That way, we can guarantee that no two users in the database are going to have the same ID. Great. Now that we install it, we can copy this, go back to our application, and now go back to the top, import version 4 as UUID version 4, and as you can see, we can just call it like this. So let's copy that. And now the question is, where do we actually want to add that ID? Well, of course, when creating the user. So we need to use that right here. And this thing actually is the user ID. And now the question is how we can add this to the current user we are getting from the rec.body. Well, we can create a new object. Let's call it user with ID. And then in there, we need to spread all the properties from our current user and also add the property of ID equal to user ID. This may be a bit complex depending on how well do you know the spread operator and creation of objects. But as you can see, we just created a new object, which now represents the user, and then we spread all the properties of the user, meaning the name, the age, and then we just added one more value on top of it. And now, instead of returning user or pushing user, we can now push user with ID. Of course, we can even simplify that. As you can see, user ID is a variable only mentioned once, so we can just take the value and paste it here immediately, getting rid of this. And as you can see, user with ID is also mentioned only once, so we can just take the value and immediately have it right here. This way, we have almost the same thing as before, having the user, but this time we are also adding the ID to it. Great. So can we somehow see this in action or not? Well, of course we can. If we save this and now run npm start again, considering we've closed our server, as you can see server running, we go back to our localhost 5000 and now refresh the page. These two users do not have an ID, and that's because we created them. We just created a mock database here. We don't want to have any users here. Let's just leave it empty for starting, right? The database is empty at the start, and then if we go back and refresh, now we have no users. Good. But now how can we push new users? We already tested that out. So if we go here to the post request and we try adding one user, let's always keep adding the John. So I'll delete this and I'll just push the, oh, we already have it here. So we'll just push Johnny, for example. In here, click send. Okay, user with the name Johnny added to the database. And now if we go back to the browser, refresh, you see we do have Johnny Doe with the ID of some random gibberish numbers. Great, let's try to add one more, for example, John Doe, save it. And as you can see, if you refresh, now we have John Doe as well, but this is completely different. See CB, here we have CL, and of course everything else is different. You can see for the ending letters. Great. Now we know that each user is different in a way. We have something that we can differentiate it by. So now we can create a new route, router.get. This one is also gonna be get, but this time the path is gonna be to /users and then /ID. In a moment, I'm gonna show you why I put this colon sign right there, but for now, let's just test it out. let's create recres as we always do. You can see the pattern now. And let's just return res.send the get ID route, just like that. Now you can either test it with browser or the Postman, because you know that when we have a GET request, you can make the GET request from the browser as well. So if we now go to /users and then /ID as we specified, right? We should be able to get the get ID route, and we do. That's great. So what if we do something like /users/test? Oh, that also works. What if we do something like /users and then put the ID of some random numbers and then do that? That also works. That's because when you put the colon sign here, you're expecting anything after the user's path. So we can put anything and this route is gonna hit. So can we somehow get this ID which the user sends? For example, if he does the route to the /users and then /2, 2 being the ID, can we somehow retrieve the value of 2 in this callback function? We can. It's stored in the request.params, params being the parameters to our function. In this case, the only param that we do have is the ID, so we're going to have an object and the ID is going to be 2. Of course, we don't only want to see comments. Let me show you that in action. In here, I'm going to do console log request.params. If we save that, or you know what, we can also show that if we do in here rec.params. Now it's going to show in the browser as well. So let's go back, do one more request to, let's say, this URL. And now, as you can see, we do get an object that has the value of our ID. Why do we need that? Well, because we want to access the data of the user's ID specified right in here. Great. Now we know that we get the ID through the rec.params. So let's do const ID is equal to rec.params.id. And you can also use destruction here. So we just take the ID value from the rec.params. Great. But we don't only want to send the ID. That doesn't make any sense. We want to send the user data for a specific ID. For that to work, we need to find a user in our users database that has the same ID. So we can do users.find. In here, we get each user. And what are we searching for? Well, we are searching for if the user.id is equal to the ID right there. If that's the case, then we're gonna get the user. Let's try putting that into a new variable, const found user, and let's try doing a, let's just try to return it. So instead of returning rec.params, we'll return the found user. Let's see if that's gonna work. Now, of course, if we go back just to /users, we don't have any users right now because we need to add them. So let's go to Postman, make another post request with the John Doe. Great, we just populated the array. If we refresh, we now see the John Doe with the ID. That's nothing special. Let's add one more person there, Johnny, for example. Okay, if you refresh one more time, we do get another object. But what's special now is that each user can look at his own profile, or right now everyone can look at everyone's profile because we don't have any authentication. But if we take this ID here and then go to /users/ and put that ID in, now we get the data only for that specific profile. That's great. The advancement to this would be for the user to be able to edit some of things only under the ID of this user, or also that we can delete the user by a certain ID. So let's implement these routes. Now we know how we need to use the route parameters to make this work. So let's create another route. The route we are going to add next is going to be router.delete. So this route is going to be for deleting users. Which users do we want to delete? Well, only the user specified in the query parameters. Then again, we do a callback function where we have the request and the response. And afterwards, of course, we need to get the ID one more time from the request.params. And now we want to remove that element from the array. For that, we can use the filter function. Const, let's say users is equal to, and now we need to filter out the users array. So users.filter. In here, we get an each user for each iteration. And then filter function works so that if whatever is here returned is equal to true, it keeps that user in the array. But if it is false, then it removes it from the array. So we want to keep all the users except the one whose ID is equal to the ID we have here. With that said, how are we going to make the logic of this work? Well, let's say that we have John. John has an ID of 1 to 3, and we also have Johnny. Or let's say Jane now. We mentioned Johnny too many times. Jane has the ID of 3 to 1. And the ID we specified, ID to delete, is equal to 1 to 3, for example. Great. So now we go into this function, user, the first time the user is John, and the user.id is equal to 1 to 3. So we want to do false for that. So we do not equal to ID. And that's it. So let's explain one more time how does this work. For the first iteration, the user is going to be John and his ID is going to be 1 to 3. The ID we want to delete is also going to be 1 to 3. We said that the filter function works so that it removes the elements for those that the function returned false. Since we have an inequality operator here and these two are equal, this is going to return false and therefore user John is going to be deleted from the array. I know it might be a bit confusing, but once you go through it a few times, it's going to start making sense. Now, if we go for the Jane, Jane's ID is 3 to 1, and 3 to 1 is indeed not equal to 1 to 3, which is true, so we keep Jane in the array. If we do this now, our delete route should work, but let's also send some information to the user. res.send, user with the ID, and then we can use the template strings ID deleted from the database, just like that. And we need to change this to be template strings. Okay, so now if we test that out, let's go back to the Postman. Remember, we cannot make delete requests or any other requests other than get requests from the browser. So we need to go back here. Let's create Johnny. Let's also create Jane. You can see Jane added to the database. And now if you make a get request, we should be able to see all the users. And you can see them right here. First name Johnny and first name Jane with their own corresponding ID. Now, if we want to remove Johnny, we take his ID, go here, change this to be a delete request, and just do /users/his ID. With that, if we send it, we should be able to get request. In this case, we get assignment to constant variable. That's of course not good. I forgot to change this from const to let, because in this case, we are changing the users array, as you can see right here. So let's save that. Let's add 2 users one more time. So we go to the post, delete this. And do we have, yeah, we have our Jane, create that, create John. And then we go to the get just to make sure that users are there. They are. We take John's ID. We go to delete request and then append that to the URL, append his ID. If we send that, the user should be deleted and we see user with the ID deleted from the database. But now when we go to the get of the users, we should see that John is no longer there. We only have Jane, which means that our delete request works completely. Great. Again, in here, we are just using the users array, but in the real database, in the MongoDB, for example, you'd be using real methods to access the user from the database and also to change or delete users from the database. Again, if you'd like that, just let me know. I'm going to create a video on that as well. Great. with that out of the way, we only have one thing left to do, and that is to change the user details. For example, if John wants to change his first name or the last name, he should be able to do that. Or maybe age. Each year he can update his age. Great. To update the user, you can see here we'll be using a patch request. Patch is used when we want to partially modify something. When you want to create something completely new, then you use post. When you want to get something, you use get, of course. When you want to delete, you use delete. But with update, it's a bit confusing. We have a patch method and we also have a put method. Put is used when you want to completely overwrite something. So if you want to change everything there is in the user, in that case, you would use a so-called put method. But to apply a partial modification, meaning if you just want to change the age or just the name, or the name and the age, doesn't really matter, then we use a patch. And that's a perfect method for our use case. So let's go there and we'll do router.patch. And the path is again gonna be the dynamic ID because we want to know which user do we want to update. Then we have the request and the response. We also get the ID, don't forget the / here. And now, how are we going to update that specific user? Well, first, we need to find the user to be updated. So let's say user to be updated. And how are we gonna find him? Well, using the users.find, or rather array.find method. Array.find goes through a lot of different users or elements in the array. And then the first one that matches, it returns it. So what do we need to match? Well, we need to match the user's ID, so user.id, to the ID coming from request.parameters. And then it's gonna return the user to be updated. Once we have that user, let's just rename it to user because user to be updated is a mouthful. So once we have that user, patch is going to be the most complicated method. In here, we use, as you can see, query parameters to get the ID, but also we're going to send something from the client side, something from the Postman. And what is that something gonna be? Well, that something is going to be things we want to replace. So if we go back right here and we do, let's take this ID, which we have right now. We put it after the users. In this case, we'll be doing a patch request. So let's go to the patch. And now we're going to send what do we want to update. So in this case, we want to send something like, let's say first name equal to Johnny. And then that's going to update the current first name of the user with this ID. Now that we know that we're going to receive some data through the request.body. So let's take these things out. What can we receive? We can receive the first name. We can also receive the last name and the age. Of course, user shouldn't be able to change his ID. We take that from request.body and then we can change those things. Just a simple if statement to check if there is a first name. If there is a first name, then we're going to set the user that first name. User, of course, being this user here, which we found, which we want to update to be simply first name. And then we can repeat this for everything. For example, in here for the last name. And also we can repeat this one more time for the age. So if there is age, then user.age is equal to age. With this, we can now change one or many different properties of the user. Just to go through this one more time, because patch indeed is the most complicated function here. We are receiving a request parameter, as you can see here, which is the ID. That ID specifies which user do we want to update. We find it here using the find method and declare a variable user. Then we take all the things coming from the request.body. Remember, we send these ourselves from the frontend or the client, in this case Postman. And then if we have the values which we want to replace something with, then we change the user.first name with the first name, user.last name with the last name, and user.age with the age. We can also write this in single line. by removing the curly braces, because this is a single line if statement, and then it's gonna look a bit cleaner. So let's leave it like this. And also now we can do a console log or just res.send user with the ID, and then of course we can specify the ID has been updated. That's it. Okay, if we test that out, we should be able to go back to the Postman, create one user first. So post to the /users, and we need to have everything in the post. So first name Johnny, last name Doe, and the age is equal to 10. Okay, we send that. We should get a response saying user with the name Johnny added to the database. Let's make a GET request just to be 100% sure. Okay, we do get it. And now we have this ID. Now we can add that ID to the URL so that we know about which user are we talking about. And then we can make a patch request to that. But this time we can include only the things we want to change regarding Johnny. So let's say that he just had his birthday and that we just want to change the age. Everything else should be left unchanged. And in here, you can see user with the ID. Oh, my bad there. I forgot to make this into a template string. Okay, just like that. Has been updated. Great. Now, if we go to the GET request to get all the users, we should get the Johnny with the age of 11, and all of his other first name and last name and the ID have been left unchanged. Amazing. That's exactly what we tried to accomplish. Our application is almost done. I would like to just get your attention to one thing. Notice how this user's routes file is not only routes. Of course, we do have the routes, but these routes have a lot of logic in them. And we should try to separate the logic from the routing. If you just keep scrolling, you can easily get lost. We have the delete route, the patch route, then we have two different get routes. You can get lost and maybe not know which route is doing what. So what people usually do is that they create a folder called controllers. Controllers, just like this. We created the routes and we created the controllers. Inside of the controllers, you can create file with the same name, users.js. And then what are we gonna put into it? Well, let me give you an example. Our first get route is really simple, so let's do something with the post route. The post route has two parameters. First one being the /route, just /users, and the second one being callback function, which is going to be executed once someone visits that route. So we can take that and we can separate that into a new function, Const, and that's gonna be create user. And that's gonna be a function, but we don't actually have to create this function block. We just did, we copied it right here. So if I paste this, you can see this is now a separate function, create user function. And it does exactly that, it creates a user. So right now we can just put that here. Instead of having it immediately in the route, we now took it out into a new function and are using it right there. You may say that this doesn't make a lot of sense, and some may agree, but now we're going to take this function and extract it into a separate file. And that file is users.js of the controllers section. In here, we have the create user. The only thing we have to do is export it. So export const create user. Once you do that, save the file, head back to the routes, and then at the top, make sure to import it. So in here, we're going to do import. Let's do it after this one. Import curly braces, create user from /controllers/users.js. And now, as you can see, we are using this function. I would like you to do the same thing for all the other routes. Let me show you how to do it for a few more. In here, we're gonna take this function, call it get user. And now we can also go to the controllers, export const get user is equal to and now I just paste it. And that's it. We just transferred the getUser function as well as the createUser function. So now the functions are in a separate window or a separate file, and all the routes are nicely tucked in here. That's great. We also need to import it. So let's do import getUser as well. Now we have those two. And in here, for some reason, I have user. It should be createUser, of course. Okay. Notice how in here we have this, but it's being unused. It isn't used. So we need to take it and move it back to the controllers because we are using the UUID right in here in the createUser. And that's also one way to show you we want to deal with the logic right there. In here, we add the IDs, we do something different, we import different modules, we return some things, but in the routes, we only want to have routes. Looks like we have an error right now, and let's see why is that happening. Oh, we are missing the .js extension right here in the routes. If we add that, we should be fine. Server running on port localhost HTTP 5000, great. Now let's do the same thing for all the other routes. This one is going to be getUser, and again, I made an error. In here, we have the getUsers, plural, because it's getting multiple users. So I'm gonna just change that, move to controllers, change it here as well, and keep adding more functions. So export const, getUser, singular this time, and make it equal to what we just copied there. Okay. Gonna keep doing that for a few more functions. Let's just add all the names here. So getUser, then we're gonna have deleteUser and also updateUser. Okay, let me take the code for the deleteUser. And move to the controllers to add it. Export const delete. User is equal to this function right there. And finally, we have one more left, which is the updateUser or the patch. I'm gonna take this code, call it updateUser, and then in the controllers, export const updateUser is equal to this whole function, which we just copied right there. Now you can see we have all the logic for our handlers right there, all the functions. You can even collapse them like this. And now in the routes, see how simple this looks. Now we only have the routes here, and they are telling you so much more than they used to before. Now you can see once we do the /users, we just do the function responsible for getting the users. Once we want to get a user with a specific ID, then we have getUser. If we want to delete user with a specific ID, we call the deleteUser function, and then you can see the function is actually in the controllers. The last thing I forgot to do is to take this users array and also move it to the controllers just at the top. Great. That's it. Now let's give our application one last test. Let's go to our localhost and see if everything works perfectly, because we did change a lot of things. Okay, starting with the browser, if we do make a GET request to /users, we do see an empty array. Now in the Postman, let's make a post request to create a few users. So inside of the Postman, make a post request, and let's take the data for one specific user. In this case, I'm just gonna copy this Johnny one and have it like this. There we have the Johnny, and let's add him. So I do post request send user Johnny added to the database. Let's add Jane as well. And finally, we can add John. Okay, user John added. Now we can go back to the browser, refresh, and we indeed do see all three users in the database. Great. So what can we do with them? Let's take the ID and let's go to /users /.id. Then we get the information only for that specific user. What else can we do? Well, if we go here and now try to delete a user, I'm gonna do the delete route and then add the ID after the users in the path, run the function, and as you can see, user with the ID deleted from the database. How can we be sure that that happened? We go back here to /users, make a GET request, and you can see we only have Jane and John. And the last thing to test out would be if we can actually modify a user. To do that, we're going to make a patch request to a specific user's ID. We cannot do this one because we just deleted it, so we need to take a new one. Let's do Jane, for example, and modify it here. And now we need to send some data. Let's say that Jane remarried and now she's married to Joan with 2 E's at the end of the surname. Let's do that and let's save it. As you can see, user with the ID has been updated. And now if we go back to the users, save it, you can see it's still Jane, the age is still 24, but now the last name has changed, which means that our update function works perfectly. And there you have it. This is the full application. As you can see, the file structure is not that bad. We have the index.js file with the setup of the server, then we have the routes for all the routing, and finally we have the controllers for making things work and adding the logic. If you'd like me to create a video with connecting this to the database, or maybe even creating a full stack Mern application on this topic, let me know in the comments and like this video. Thank you so much and see you in the next one.